Linda and I had just wrapped up our Saturday breakfast. We were sitting across from each other, lost in the news on our tablets, when the doorbell rang out of nowhere. The sudden sound made Linda flinch, her reaction sharper than usual. Lately, I'd noticed her acting a little jumpy, like she was on edge about something. Oddly enough, that edginess had brought us closer than we'd been in months, turning up the heat in a marriage that had been running pretty cold for half a year. Putting my tablet aside, I got to my feet. "I'll handle it," I said, heading to the door. Opening it, I came face to face with two men holding up police badges. "Good morning," I greeted, keeping my voice steady. "What can I do for you?" The taller of the two looked me square in the eye and asked, "Are you Mr. David Campbell?" I nodded. "That's me." He introduced himself and his partner as Officers Stevens and Peters from the Austin Police Department, then handed me a thick stack of papers. "We have a search warrant," he said plainly. "A search warrant?" I repeated, thrown off balance. "What's this about?" The officer replied evenly, "It's all outlined in the document. If you need to, you can call your lawyer." Then, with a glance past me, he added, "We'd also like to speak with your wife, Linda Campbell. Is she available?" I gestured toward the kitchen. "She's in there," I said, leading them down the hall. Skimming the warrant as we walked, I saw it focused on Linda. It mentioned firearms and the personal items of someone named Charles O'Brien. When we reached the kitchen, I turned to the officers. "This wouldn't happen to be about that rich guy who turned up dead last week, would it?" Linda works for one of his companies, but we didn't know him personally. I looked over at her as I said this. Her face had gone ghostly pale, her wide eyes practically screaming guilt. If these cops were searching for signs of nervousness, they didn't have to look far. "Linda, do you have any idea what's going on here?" I asked, irritation creeping into my voice. "They're saying you might be connected to Charles O'Brien's murder." One of the officers held up a hand, cutting me off. "Sir, let us handle the questions. We need you to step out of the kitchen for now. This is between us and Mrs. Campbell." "Wait a minute," I shot back. "Is she under arrest? Because if she is, she needs a lawyer before she says another word." Turning to Linda, I added, "Do you want me to call my lawyer? He can find someone to represent you." Her voice was barely audible as she nodded. "Yes, please," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "That's within her rights," the officer said with a nod. "For now, we're not making any arrests. We're just here to collect evidence and ask questions. But we will need to schedule formal interviews with both of you. That can happen at the station, and of course, you're entitled to legal counsel for those conversations." Then he looked at me. "One more thing, sir. Do you have any firearms in the house that we should know about?" "I don't mind answering your questions right here," I replied, my tone firm. "I've got nothing to hide. I didn't know O'Brien. As for firearms, I own a few pistols. Most of them are locked in a safe, but there's one in my bedside drawer." The officer nodded. "Would you mind showing Officer Peters the firearm in your drawer, as well as the ones in your safe?" Realizing I didn't have much of a choice, I agreed. "Sure, follow me," I said, leading Peters to the bedroom. Opening the top drawer of my nightstand, I pointed to the pistol inside. "There it is," I told him. Wearing gloves, he carefully retrieved the Taurus Judge, placed it in a bag, and looked back at me. "Thank you, sir. Could you now take me to the safe?" "Of course, it's in my office," I replied, walking him there. After entering the combination, I swung open the heavy safe door. "We'll need to take all of your firearms for testing," he explained. "We'll provide you with a receipt, and once testing is complete, everything will be returned." I nodded. "Fine," I said, resigned. Speaking into a small microphone, Peters called for his team. "Otis, bring your crew. We need to log and transport several firearms," he instructed. A moment later, a voice replied, "On it, boss." Soon, Otis and a group of officers arrived, carrying cases and equipment to catalog the weapons. Peters gave them instructions while the rest of the team began their search of the house, methodically going through every room and even the cars in the garage. They weren't outright trashing the place, but by the time they were done, our home looked like a whirlwind had passed through. Hours later, the officers wrapped up, gathering by their cars to quietly discuss their findings. Meanwhile, I kept shooting Linda questioning looks, silently demanding answers she wasn't offering. She barely seemed aware of me, lost in her own thoughts. Finally, Peters returned to the door, handing me a receipt. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said, as though I'd had much of a choice. Scanning the list, I noted they'd taken 5 rifles and 4 pistols, all meticulously logged. Officer Peters asked to speak with Linda next, so I led him back into the kitchen. She was still seated at the table, her head hanging low as if the weight of everything was pressing down on her. Her face was red and puffy, clear signs she'd been crying. Peters approached her with a softer demeanor, handing her his card and suggesting she schedule an interview at the station once she had legal representation sorted out. She gave a faint nod, her voice barely audible as she muttered, "All right." Afterward, Peters requested a private conversation with me in my office. He reminded me that I could have a lawyer present, but I waved it off. I had no connection to Charles O'Brien aside from knowing Linda worked for one of his companies, and I couldn't imagine why the police would be interested in me. The questioning lasted less than an hour, mostly because I had no helpful information. I explained I didn't know O'Brien personally and had no reason to cross paths with him. Then, to my surprise, they asked if I'd had any issues with him. That question threw me. Why would I? I didn't even know the man. I told them, confused. The officers moved on, pressing for details about my whereabouts on the night of his murder. Pulling out my phone, I checked my calendar and explained I'd spent that evening with my friendly Rogers. Linda had told me she'd be at her aunt's place in Fredericksburg overnight, so I'd taken Lee up on an invite to dinner at his house. His wife, Pat, joined us for the meal, and afterward, Lee and I went for a flight in his private plane. Lee lives in a small community with its own airstrip and has been flying for years, so I trusted him completely. The officers took down Lee's full name, address, and phone number, explaining they might need to confirm my story. Later, I found out they did just that. Lee and Pat both vouched for me, even providing HOA security footage showing our plane taking off at 8:05 p.m. and landing at 9:15 p.m. The evidence lined up perfectly. Once they were satisfied, the officers thanked me for my cooperation and finally left. I went back to the kitchen, where Linda was still sitting, her head lowered again. Frustration bubbled up inside me, and I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked, "What's going on, Linda? You work for one of O'Brien's companies, but I never thought you had any kind of connection to him. Were you involved with him in some way?" Her lip quivered, and her eyes filled with fresh tears. She whispered, "I'm so sorry," before bolting out of the kitchen and locking herself in our bedroom. The following week was a nightmare. News of the police search hit the local media, and soon reporters were swarming us, shouting for comments whenever we left the house. O'Brien's murder had become a high-profile case, and our lawyer warned us to stay silent. My attorney referred Linda to Ted Walker, a sharp defense lawyer, but she insisted I stay out of their initial meeting. That only made my unease grow. From what I'd learned, Charles O'Brien was a millionaire who'd made his fortune in the tech industry. He'd gained some notoriety for outsourcing much of his workforce a few years back, but still managed to keep a public image as a philanthropist. Behind the scenes, though, he had a reputation for going after married women. Walker set up Linda's interview with the police for Friday, assuring us it was just routine and that they likely didn't have solid evidence. He couldn't have been more wrong. Just before noon that day, I got a call from Linda. Her voice was shaking, and I could barely make out the words as she told me they'd arrested her and charged her with O'Brien's murder. She'd been taken to the women's jail downtown, with a bail hearing scheduled for Monday. When I asked if I could attend, she said the hearing would be closed to the public. Late Monday afternoon, Linda called again. She was sobbing, her voice cracking as she explained the judge had set her bail at $500,000. "Can you post it?" she asked, her desperation bleeding through the line. I'd never dealt with bail before, so I started Googling. That's when I learned about bail bondsmen and their 10% non-refundable fee, in this case, a hefty $50,000. It wasn't that we couldn't afford it. My recruiting business had done well over the past few years, but throwing away $50,000 wasn't a casual decision. I told her, "If you want my help, you're going to have to tell me everything. No holding back." She agreed, her voice trembling with fear and regret. Her lawyer, Walker, arranged a meeting for us in the jail's interrogation room. He assured me he'd explain the charges and what to expect. But deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what Linda had to say. When I arrived at the jail, they patted me down for weapons and checked for any contraband before escorting me to a small, cold room designed for attorneys and their clients. Linda was already seated across from Walker, her posture slumped and her face pale. The bright orange jumpsuit she wore only added to the humiliation of her situation. Before I could say anything, Walker jumped straight to the point, taking over the conversation like a lawyer in a courtroom. "You're going to hear all of this eventually, so let's lay it out now," he began in a calm, measured tone. Linda and Charles O'Brien were having an affair. It lasted about 6 months and ended with his death. His words hit me like a sledgehammer. I stared at Linda, my anger boiling over. "So, you've been cheating on me?" I growled, barely keeping my voice steady. "That explains a lot. No wonder being with you felt like a chore until that guy died. He was just using you, wasn't he? And you went along with it, lying to me the whole damn time." Linda flinched at my words, lowering her head as tears streamed down her face. She stayed silent, her sobs echoing in the small room. Walker raised his hand in a placating gesture. "I know this is a lot to process, but despite the affair, I'm confident she didn't kill O'Brien." "Oh, really?" I shot back. "Then why is she sitting here in a jumpsuit? They must have found something pretty damning to arrest her." Walker let out a long sigh before explaining. He painted a vivid picture of the crime scene. A sprawling ranch in the Texas Hill Country covering hundreds of hectares. Though the house there wasn't as luxurious as O'Brien's Lake Austin estate, it was still an impressive two-story property with all the bells and whistles: a pool, a tennis court, and state-of-the-art security. Cameras surrounded the house and monitored the grounds, though O'Brien only activated the interior ones when he wasn't home. Unfortunately, those cameras had been off the night he was killed. "The police showed Linda the footage," Walker explained. "Around 9 p.m. that night, O'Brien's Lamborghini is seen pulling into the driveway. The interior cameras captured him parking in the garage and disabling the system. Then, at about 1 a.m., the exterior cameras recorded Linda's Lexus arriving. They caught her walking to the front door and letting herself in. A few minutes later, the same camera showed her leaving in a hurry, practically sprinting back to her car before driving off." I let out a low whistle. "That's not a good look," I muttered, turning to Linda with narrowed eyes. "So, tell me, did you actually kill him?" Walker jumped in before she could respond, cautioning her not to say anything. But she shook her head and blurted out, "No, I swear I didn't. When I walked in, he was sitting in a chair with his back to me. I thought he was asleep, but when I got closer, I saw the bullet hole in his forehead and blood everywhere. I panicked and ran." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words settling on me. "Why should I believe you?" I asked coldly. "You've already proven you're a liar, sneaking around for 6 months while I was out working to keep a roof over your head. And now you want me to fork over $50,000 to bail you out." Walker quickly tried to de-escalate the situation, explaining that, as a married couple in Texas, half of our money legally belonged to Linda. If needed, she could access the funds without my approval. That didn't sit well with me, but I reluctantly agreed to help with one condition. I made it clear that once this was over, we were done. Walker attempted to reassure me. "I genuinely believe we can get the charges dropped," he said. He went on to explain that while Linda had been at the scene and fled, the police lacked concrete evidence tying her to the murder. "Ballistics ruled out every firearm from your home," he added. "But unfortunately, the surveillance cameras only captured 2 people entering the property that week: O'Brien and Linda." As news of the case spread, life became unbearable. Reporters camped outside our house, bombarding me at my office and on the street with questions about my cheating wife and her alleged role in O'Brien's death. Their questions were cutting, insinuating I'd been blind to everything. I'd had enough when one asked if I had known about the affair. "I didn't know him or any so-called relationship with my wife," I snapped. "If I had, things would have gone very differently." I kicked Linda out of our bedroom after that. She moved into the guest room, and I added a lock to my door to make sure she stayed out. When she told me Walker thought it was important to present a united front for the sake of her case, I laughed bitterly. A united front? Now that your lover's dead, you suddenly want to act like a devoted wife? Where was that unity when you decided to cheat on me with him?" I stared at her, the frustration and betrayal rising. "Honestly, after everything I've heard, I wouldn't put it past you to have killed him. You're not just unfaithful, you're dangerous. And frankly, I'm glad the cops took my guns. I don't trust you anywhere near me anymore." Her stunned expression as I walked away told me she hadn't expected that, but at this point, I was past caring. The back and forth between the district attorney and Walker finally resulted in a plea deal: manslaughter, with a 2-year sentence and eligibility for parole after just 1 year. I was stunned by how light the sentence seemed, but Walker explained that the prosecution had struggled to establish a clear motive. O'Brien had showered Linda with gifts and even deposited $250,000 into a secret account she'd been hiding from me. When I found out about that account, I demanded she reimburse the $50,000 bail I had paid out of it. She didn't argue. Despite exhaustive police efforts, the murder weapon was never found. Linda continued to maintain her innocence, but Walker strongly urged her to take the plea. He pointed out that a trial was a gamble. Her reputation as the other woman would sway a jury, and the security footage left little room for doubt. After agonizing over it for days, Linda tearfully agreed. A week later, the judge approved the plea, giving her 2 weeks to report to the women's prison. As we walked out of the courthouse that day, I handed her divorce papers. Letting her know it was over gave me a sense of closure, even if it didn't erase the bitterness. The day before she was due to turn herself in, Linda reached out, asking if we could talk one last time. I didn't want to hear a word from her, but I agreed, on one condition: she'd sign the divorce papers afterward. She hesitated before reluctantly agreeing. I set up a meeting at the house that evening, ensuring my lawyer and a notary would be present. The divorce settlement was simple. We'd split everything equally, but she wouldn't get a dime from my business or any spousal support. The $250,000 from O'Brien's secret account would cover her share, sparing my personal finances. When she arrived that evening, Linda looked like a shadow of her former self, tired, pale, and worn down. She sat across from me, took a deep, shaky breath, and began. "Thanks for agreeing to talk," she said softly. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am, for everything, for getting involved with Charles, for betraying you. I was in a bad place. You were working all the time, and I felt invisible." Then he showed up, saying all the right things. She paused, searching my face for a reaction, but I stayed silent. I'm not trying to excuse what I did. I knew who he was. I knew the rumors about him going after married women, but when he noticed me, it felt good. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I mattered. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a bitter chuckle. "You're a beautiful woman, Linda. It doesn't surprise me that he went after you." A flicker of relief crossed her face, like she wasn't expecting even a backhanded compliment. "I never stopped loving you," she continued, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know it sounds crazy, but what we had was real. I didn't love Charles. Not really. I thought, somehow, I could have both. I know how ridiculous that sounds now. My affair wasn't about you. It was about me and this emptiness I couldn't shake. We almost never talked about you. And the one time he insulted you, I left. I told him I wouldn't tolerate it, and not long after, he set up that account with the $250,000. I shook my head, a mix of disgust and disbelief tightening in my chest. "Unbelievable," I muttered. "This is straight out of the cheater's playbook. You knew I'd never forgive you if I found out. So what exactly did you think would happen, Linda? Were you just waiting for me to catch on?" Her head dropped, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. Maybe I thought I'd never get caught. Or maybe I thought, I don't know. I deserve this, David. I know your values. They're part of why I fell in love with you back in college. But I guess every cheater convinces themselves they're the exception, that they won't get caught. And maybe the risk is part of the thrill." She paused, then locked eyes with me. "But for all my mistakes, you know I didn't kill him. You know that, David. So tell me, did you do it? Did you hire someone?" I stared at her, stunned by the accusation. Then I smirked, leaning forward. "Nice try. Did Walker tell you to ask that? Fishing for a confession?" Her face went pale, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. You know as well as I do that it's ridiculous. The footage doesn't lie. The only two people in O'Brien's house were you and him, and he left with a bullet in his head. So why don't you stop the games and admit it? Did he tell you it was over? That you were just a fling? Is that why you pulled the trigger? Linda's face twisted with anger. Go to hell, she hissed, pushing back from the table. Gladly, I shot back, turning my back on Linda just as the doorbell rang. My lawyer and the notary had arrived right on time. This conversation is over. Let's wrap up this farce of a marriage, I said as I went to greet them. True to her word, Linda signed the divorce papers without protest. In a few months, I'd officially be a free man, and she'd be sitting behind bars in a medium security prison. As a final act of closure, or maybe just to make sure she was actually locked away, I drove her there myself. Watching her walk through those gates was oddly satisfying. 6 months later, I found myself at Lee's place, celebrating the official end of my marriage. The final divorce decree had come through earlier in the week, and we decided it deserved a proper toast. Sitting in Lee's basement bar, surrounded by the smell of whiskey and cigar smoke, I finally asked the question that had been lingering in the back of my mind. Do you feel any guilt, Lee? I asked, my voice steady but curious. Lee leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. No, he replied without hesitation. That bastard ruined my little sister's life. He may not have pulled the trigger, but he seduced her, knowing she was married and had kids. When her husband found out and kicked her out, O'Brien dropped her too, like she was nothing. She was left with nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And when she couldn't handle the shame, she ended her own life. He's the one who drove her to it. I remembered the anguish Lee had gone through after Amanda's death. It was still fresh in his voice as he exhaled a slow stream of cigar smoke. I nodded, understanding his rage all too well. Then he turned to me, his eyes sharp. What about you? Feel guilty about sending Linda to prison? I shrugged. Not really, I said, swirling the whiskey in my glass. She brought it on herself. She knew the deal. She knew what I'd do if I found out she was cheating, but she went ahead anyway. And honestly, learning to fly your plane was the silver lining. I wouldn't have bothered otherwise. I let out a bitter laugh. But O'Brien? That guy needed to be stopped. He tore apart too many lives, wrecked too many families. The law might not have cared, but someone had to. Lee raised his beer in agreement. Sometimes, morality and the law don't line up, brother. We clinked glasses and sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Eventually, I broke the quiet. We haven't really talked about it, but was it hard? I mean, to pull the trigger on O'Brien? Lee chuckled darkly, taking another drag from his cigar. It felt like recoil, he said with a wry smile. Lee's Special Forces training had prepared him for moments like this, but this wasn't a mission, it was personal. After Amanda's death, his focus had narrowed to one goal: ending O'Brien. The skills he'd honed in the military gave him the precision and patience to pull it off, but the drive came from his grief and anger. I thought back to how it had all started. Lee and I had been friends for years, fishing buddies, hunting partners, the kind of friends who could rely on each other for anything. When I first told him about Linda's affair with O'Brien, his reaction had been immediate. He already knew O'Brien's name and reputation, and once we put the pieces together, he convinced me to play the long game. Lee had done his homework, mapping out O'Brien's ranch in the hill country and learning every detail about its security setup. Amanda had once told him about the property's quirks, including O'Brien's habit of leaving the interior cameras off whenever he was home. That detail became the cornerstone of the plan. I still remember the day I discovered a text from O'Brien on Linda's phone. It was innocent enough on the surface, probably meant to hide the affair in plain sight, but it confirmed everything. From there, Lee began strategizing, and I reluctantly became part of his plan. My role was straightforward: learn to fly his plane and let him handle the rest. The months of lessons were grueling, and the knowledge of why I was learning weighed heavily on me. The idea of killing a man wasn't abstract anymore. It was real, and I was helping make it happen. We kept tabs on Linda using a GPS tracker Lee had slipped onto her car and monitored her texts through a passcode I'd managed to figure out. Lee was meticulous, piecing together her schedule and planning down to the smallest detail. The morning of the plan, Lee drove an old, beat-up Jeep to a secluded spot a couple of kilometers from O'Brien's ranch. He camouflaged it with a net, swapped out the license plates with some he'd taken from an abandoned car, and left it hidden. Afterward, I picked him up and dropped him off at his place before heading home. By noon, I was back at my desk, playing the part of a man who had no idea his wife's lover was about to meet his end. That evening, Lee and I carried out the plan exactly as I described to the police, but this time, I was the one flying the plane. Lee sat beside me, a ghost in the cockpit, completely covered in black, from his gloves to the balaclava masking his face. His night vision goggles and square military parachute gave him the appearance of someone straight out of a nightmare. Strapped to his chest was a small pack containing everything he needed for a swift, efficient exit. The parachute, as he'd assured me, was precise enough to land him directly on O'Brien's second-floor balcony, which led to a guest bedroom he'd scouted as an easy entry point. With Lee barking out directions, I maneuvered the plane into position over the drop zone. When we hit the mark, he opened the door, the wind roaring in my ears as he leaned out. "Let's make it count, buddy," he yelled before vanishing into the darkness. The conditions couldn't have been better for Lee's descent. No moonlight, a starless sky, and calm winds. He landed effortlessly on O'Brien's balcony, just as planned, avoiding the range of the security cameras. Within seconds, he picked the lock on the sliding glass door and slipped into the house like a shadow. From his reconnaissance, he knew O'Brien would deactivate the interior cameras once he got home, leaving him completely exposed. Inside, Lee moved with the practiced stealth of his Special Forces days. He positioned himself where he could observe O'Brien without being seen, waiting patiently as O'Brien went through his nightly routine. Through the GPS tracker we'd placed on Linda's car, we knew she was still an hour away, giving Lee a small but critical window to act. When O'Brien finally settled into his chair, Lee stepped out of the shadows, gun leveled at his chest. O'Brien's response was predictable: shock, followed by an attempt to buy his way out. He stammered offers of money, property, anything that might save his life. Lee ignored him, his expression cold and unflinching. Stepping closer, he leaned in and whispered, "This is for Amanda." The words hit O'Brien like a hammer. His face twisted in terror as the realization sank in. Lee noticed a dark stain spreading across the front of his pants, a final act of humiliation for a man who'd ruined so many lives. Without another word, Lee pulled the trigger, silencing O'Brien forever. The escape was as meticulously planned as the execution. From his pack, Lee retrieved a custom-made ultralight hang glider, a marvel of engineering, crafted from lightweight aluminum struts that snapped together in minutes. Working quickly on the balcony, he assembled the frame and attached the fabric wing, checking every connection twice. The exterior cameras wouldn't pick him up unless he lingered too long, so he moved with the urgency of a man who knew he couldn't afford mistakes. Once the glider was ready, Lee climbed onto the roof, hauling the frame up after him. The incline was steep but manageable, and the breeze had picked up slightly, offering ideal lift conditions. Standing at the peak of the roof, he took a moment to steady himself, feeling the weight of the night pressing down. Then, with a running start, he launched into the air, gliding silently into the void. Later, Lee told me the flight felt surreal, adrenaline carrying him nearly half a kilometer before he touched down. Once on the ground, he disassembled the glider with the same precision he'd used to put it together, packed up his gear, and returned to the hidden Jeep. Within minutes, he was gone, leaving nothing behind. The next day, Lee methodically disposed of every piece of evidence: the gun, the glider, his clothes, and even his boots. All of it vanished without a trace. Listening to him recount the night in vivid detail, I couldn't help but shake my head in awe. "Lee, you've been out of the game for over a decade, but you haven't missed a beat," I said, genuinely impressed. He gave me a wry grin, exhaling a puff of cigar smoke. "I did it for Amanda. She deserved justice, even if the law wouldn't give it to her." He raised his glass, quoting an old country song with a smirk. "I ain't as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was." We toasted to that, two men bound by secrets, sitting in silence as the weight of what we'd done hung in the air like the smoke swirling between us. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.